Welcome to another episode of Serial Killer Files by Skoob, where we delve deep into history's most chilling true crime stories. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're traveling to 1940s Italy to uncover one of the most disturbing cases in criminal history. This is the story of Leonarda Cianciulli, the Soap-Maker of Correggio. Picture this: a small Italian town in the 1940s. Neighbors exchanging pleasantries over garden fences. The local shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman known for her kindness, offering homemade soap and delicious tea cakes to visitors. A scene of perfect domestic tranquility, right? But what if I told you that those innocent gifts, the creamy soap bars and sweet-smelling cakes, contained a horrifying secret? What if the woman everyone trusted had transformed three human beings into these very items? Meet Leonarda Cianciulli, born in 1894 in the impoverished town of Montella in Italy's Campania region. She would become one of Italy's most infamous female serial killers, earning the chilling nickname, the Soap-Maker of Correggio. Her crimes shocked not just Italy, but the entire world, not only because of their gruesome nature, but because they shattered the conventional understanding of who could commit such acts. In a society where violence was largely associated with men, Cianciulli represented something far more terrifying: the corruption of maternal instinct itself. She famously declared, "I had to destroy in order to save," a statement that offers a glimpse into a mind shaped by fear, superstition, and an obsessive need to control destiny. To understand how a seemingly ordinary woman could commit such extraordinary evil, we must first understand the Italy of her time. The early 20th century was a period of profound upheaval for the newly unified nation. Italy had only achieved unification in the latter half of the 19th century and was still struggling to create a cohesive national identity. The economy remained primarily agricultural, with rural communities like Montella trapped in crushing poverty. Industrialization was concentrated in the north, leaving the south economically disadvantaged and socially fragmented. As historian Dennis Max Smith observed, the South remained a land of backwardness, superstition, and poverty, where the authority of the state was often weak. This wasn't just economic hardship. It was a cultural powder keg. Early 20th century Italy was steeped in traditional Catholic values and rigid patriarchal norms. Family honor and reputation were everything. Women were expected to conform to strict roles of obedience and domesticity. Mental illness, domestic abuse, and psychological trauma often went completely unacknowledged and untreated. Scholars note that superstition and fatalism were not merely remnants of an archaic culture, but coping mechanisms for those trapped by poverty and social constraints. This is crucial to understanding Cianciulli's later actions. In a world where rational solutions seemed impossible, irrational beliefs flourished. The political context made everything worse. By the 1920s and 1930s, Mussolini's fascist regime promised order and strength, while suppressing dissent and controlling social institutions. For people like Cianciulli, living on society's margins, the gap between fascist promises and harsh reality created a climate of fear and isolation. It was in this toxic environment that a woman's personal tragedies would transform into something monstrous. Leonarda Cianciulli's descent into madness began with an act of love and a mother's curse. In 1917, she married Raphael Pansardi, a register office clerk, directly against her mother Rosa Pica's wishes. This wasn't just family drama. In Cianciulli's superstitious worldview, her mother's angry response carried the weight of destiny itself. Rosa Pica pronounced a terrible curse upon her defiant daughter, creating a permanent estrangement that would haunt Cianciulli for the rest of her life. This maternal hex became a central pillar of her paranoid worldview, feeding her lifelong anxiety about fate and misfortune. In her mind, she was marked for tragedy, before her adult life had even truly begun. The young couple moved frequently in their early marriage years, including an unsuccessful stint in her husband's hometown of Loria, before settling back in Montella. Despite the alleged curse, Cianciulli threw herself into being a devoted wife and mother, desperately trying to build stability against the forces she believed were arrayed against her. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. In 1930, a devastating earthquake destroyed their home in Montella, forcing the family to flee north to Correggio, in the province of Reggio Emilia. For someone already convinced that supernatural forces were targeting her family, this natural disaster must have felt like confirmation of her worst fears. In Correggio, Cianciulli opened a small shop selling clothing and soap, products that would later take on a horrifying significance. To her neighbors, she appeared to be the perfect citizen. Kind, gentle, well-liked, attentive to her family, and a successful businesswoman. But beneath this facade, her anxieties were being reinforced by another dark prophecy. A local fortune teller predicted that she would end up in either a prison or a criminal asylum. Combined with her mother's curse, this prediction hardened her conviction that a dark fate awaited both her and her family. The seeds of paranoia had been planted, and they were beginning to sprout. What transformed Cianciulli from an anxious woman into a killer was an almost unimaginable series of personal losses. Her marriage was overshadowed by a burden that would have broken most people. She experienced 17 pregnancies in total, mirroring the large number of siblings she had lost in her own childhood. 17 pregnancies. Let that number sink in for a moment. Of these 17 attempts at motherhood, only 4 children survived to adulthood: 3 sons named Giuseppe, Bernardo, and Biagio, and 1 daughter, Norma. The other 13 pregnancies ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, and the deaths of infants and young children. Imagine living through that cycle of hope and devastating loss, again and again and again. This relentless trauma had a catastrophic psychological effect. It created an obsessive attachment to her surviving children, particularly her eldest son, Giuseppe. These children weren't just her offspring. They were the only tangible proof of her worth, the only thing she could control in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything she loved. Her maternal love twisted into something pathological. She became hyper-vigilant to the point of paranoia, convinced that if she didn't fight fate with extreme measures, her remaining children would be taken from her just like all the others. Every small illness, every minor accident, every moment of danger became proof that supernatural forces were plotting against her family. This deep-seated terror transformed natural maternal instinct into something monstrous. She began to see herself not as a protector, but as a warrior in an invisible battle against destiny itself. As her fears intensified, Cianciulli's relationship with superstition evolved from casual belief into dangerous obsession. In her world of poverty, uncertainty, and loss, supernatural signs became both warnings and instructions for action. She frequently consulted local fortune tellers and mediums, desperately seeking reassurance about her family's future. But more disturbing was her claim that spirits communicated with her directly. "The spirits told me what had to be done, and I could not refuse them," she would later confess. This wasn't just religious faith or cultural tradition. It was a complete surrender of moral reasoning to supernatural authority. The boundary between superstition and action began to blur as she internalized the belief that failing to heed these spiritual signs could result in catastrophe for her loved ones. Her fear became an all-consuming motivator, driving her toward increasingly extreme measures. Even before her known murders, warning signs were apparent. Cianciulli displayed manipulative behaviors that revealed her growing obsession with control. She persuaded neighbors and acquaintances to follow her guidance in personal matters, leveraging their fears and superstitions to control outcomes. She presented herself as both a pious and mystical figure, someone capable of influencing fate itself. She manipulated her own husband and children through threats and guilt, reinforcing her authority with a toxic combination of emotional coercion and religious justification. As scholars observed, her early manipulations were not overtly criminal, but revealed a willingness to impose her worldview on others, foreshadowing the extreme actions she would later take. Her home became a shrine to superstition. She collected charms, consulted oracles, and interpreted minor events as signs of impending doom. Small accidents, illnesses, or misfortunes became proof of supernatural disapproval, warnings that she needed to act. Her entire mental framework began to rely on a twisted system of cause and effect, where her interventions were necessary to prevent disaster. "I had to listen to the spirits," she would later explain. "If I ignored them, my family would suffer." This was no longer eccentricity. It was a complete break from rational thought, creating a psychological environment where murder could seem not just justified, but morally necessary. The immediate trigger for Cianciulli's transformation from obsessed mother to serial killer came in 1939, when her greatest fear materialized. Her beloved eldest son, Giuseppe Pansardi, prepared to join the Italian military as Italy geared up for World War II. For a woman who had already lost 13 children and lived in constant terror of losing the remaining 4, this was the ultimate threat. The possibility of war taking the child she had fought so desperately to protect shattered what remained of her psychological equilibrium. The ancient maternal curse, the fortune teller's dark prophecy, and now the very real prospect of her son's death in combat. It was too much for her fractured mind to bear. She became utterly convinced that the only way to appease the malevolent forces determined to destroy her family was through human sacrifice. Her twisted logic was terrifyingly simple. By sacrificing other lives, she could create a protective spell or arrange some supernatural exchange for her son's safety. In her delusional worldview, this wasn't murder. It was the ultimate act of maternal love. She was determined to ensure Giuseppe's safety at any cost. This phrase would haunt her trial and cement her place in criminal history. The woman who had once been known for her kindness was about to become the instrument of fate she had always feared. Her targets would be 3 local women, each lured to their deaths by a combination of trust and manipulation. But the horrifying truth was that Cianciulli genuinely believed she was saving her family through these ritual murders. In her mind, she wasn't destroying lives, she was exchanging them. This terrifying transformation illustrates how personal trauma, cultural beliefs, and unchecked mental illness can combine to produce absolute evil disguised as love. Now we come to the most disturbing aspect of this case, the methodical way Leonarda Cianciulli disposed of her victims. Her infamous practice of transforming human remains into household items and food earned her that chilling nickname, the Soap-Maker of Correggio. Between 1939 and 1940, 3 women would fall victim to her twisted plan: Faustina Setti, Francesca Soavi, and Virginia Cacioppo. Each murder followed the same horrifying pattern, detailed in her own confession, with a clinical precision that still shocks today. The process began with drugged wine offered to each unsuspecting victim. Once they were incapacitated, she killed them with an axe. Quick, brutal, efficient. But it was what happened next that sets this case apart from ordinary murder. Cianciulli would transport each body to a staging area where she meticulously cut it into 9 parts, ensuring every piece was accounted for. During this dismemberment, she carefully collected the victim's blood in a basin. This wasn't random butchery, but a calculated process with a specific purpose. Listen to her own description of disposing of her first victim, Faustina Setti. I threw the pieces into a pot, added 7 kilos of caustic soda, which I had bought to make soap, and stirred the mixture until the pieces dissolved in a thick, dark mush that I poured into several buckets and emptied in a nearby septic tank. The caustic soda, lye, is traditionally used in soap making because it hydrolyzes fats and oils. In this case, it dissolved human flesh, rendering the body completely unrecognizable. But Cianciulli wasn't just disposing of evidence. She was creating products. For her final victim, Virginia Cacioppo, a former soprano, she actually refined her technique. According to her confession, she ended up in the pot like the other two. Her flesh was fat and white. When it had melted, I added a bottle of cologne, and after a long time on the boil, I was able to make some most acceptable creamy soap. I gave bars to neighbors and acquaintances. Think about that for a moment. She was distributing soap made from human remains to her neighbors, who used it unknowingly in their daily lives. But the blood served an even more disturbing purpose. After collecting it in a basin and waiting for it to coagulate, she described her grotesque culinary process. As for the blood in the basin, I waited until it had coagulated, dried it in the oven, ground it, and mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, milk, and eggs, as well as a bit of margarine, kneading all the ingredients together. I made lots of crunchy tea cakes and served them to the ladies who came to visit, though Giuseppe and I also ate them. She was baking cookies with human blood and serving them to visitors, including eating them herself and feeding them to her beloved son, Giuseppe, the very person she was trying to protect. Even more chilling, she actually critiqued the quality of her victims. About Virginia Cacioppo, she noted, "The cakes, too, were better. That woman was really sweet." This wasn't just murder. It was a complete obliteration of human dignity, transforming people into everyday objects while maintaining the facade of a helpful neighbor and skilled homemaker. Leonarda Cianciulli's gruesome crimes remained hidden for years, her meticulous methods and careful planning allowing her to avoid detection. But every criminal eventually makes a mistake, and for Cianciulli, that mistake was overconfidence. The turning point came when the family of her final victim grew suspicious of her intentions and reported their concerns to authorities. Police investigations uncovered disturbing evidence, human remains, personal items belonging to the victims, and the tools she had used in her ritualistic killings. Authorities were shocked by the nature of the evidence, which confirmed the unthinkable, that Cianciulli had indeed transformed her victims' bodies into soap and baked them into cakes. When confronted, she confessed with the same chilling matter-of-factness she had shown throughout her crimes. "I destroyed them to save my family. I had no choice." This revelation stunned the local community and set the stage for a trial that would capture national attention across war-torn Italy. Cianciulli's trial began in 1946 at the Court of Assizes in Potenza, during a period when Italy was still grappling with the aftermath of World War II. The country faced widespread poverty, dislocation, and political instability, and the judicial system, though re-established, operated under intense public scrutiny. The trial drew massive interest due to both the shocking nature of the crimes and Cianciulli's unusual psychological profile. Legal proceedings were complicated by fundamental questions of mental competence, as psychiatric evaluations revealed severe paranoia, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and moral reasoning completely distorted by superstition. The defense argued that she was mentally unbalanced and incapable of understanding the consequences of her actions. Psychiatrist Mario Fustini, who examined her, testified that she lived in a world ruled by omens, spirits, and fatalism, where murder was, in her mind, a protective act rather than a crime. but prosecutors focused on the undeniably premeditated nature of the murders and the extraordinary cruelty of her methods. Witnesses described her obsession with fortune-telling and her manipulative behavior toward the victims, establishing a clear pattern of calculated deception leading to murder. Throughout the trial, Cianciulli maintained an eerily composed demeanor, at times claiming moral justification for her acts and expressing concern for her surviving family. "I killed because I had to," she stated. "My children's lives were at stake." Media coverage was extensive and sensationalized, reflecting the public's fascination with both the brutality of the crimes and the anomaly of a female serial killer. Newspapers across Italy published lurid accounts, emphasizing the shocking contrast between her domestic facade and the monstrous reality of her actions. The story of the Soap-Maker of Correggio became a national sensation, provoking both horror and morbid curiosity. As sociologist Luigi Volpi noted, the Italian public was captivated not merely by the crimes themselves, but by the transgression of gender norms and the psychological complexity of the perpetrator. The trial also sparked broader discussions about mental illness, superstition, and the pressures faced by women in rural Italian society, issues that resonated deeply in a country trying to rebuild both its infrastructure and its social fabric. Leonarda Cianciulli was convicted in 1946 and sentenced to 30 years in prison for the calculated murders of 3 women. Though psychiatrists cited mental illness, the court held her accountable, and she died behind bars in 1970, still believing her acts protected her family. The Soap-Maker of Correggio remains a haunting case, a story where love, trauma, and delusion twisted into something unthinkable, forcing us to question the line between devotion and destruction. But what details of her rituals, motives, and final confessions still unsettle investigators today? And what truths about her victims are often left untold? Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story and uncover every chilling layer waiting beyond this episode.